Section 8, The Media and Society, Chapter 53. Why doesn't the media tell us about the Bilderbergs? I love America, especially the freedom and unlimited potential it represents. I also despise with every ounce of venom in my body the sick, evil Satan controllers that are deliberately in the process of destroying this great nation. And if you don't think it's happening, take a look at what occurred on September 11, 2001, and realize what those bastards are capable of. The destruction in Washington, D.C. and New York City was no accident, and the powers that be who rule our world were behind it. Sure, Islamic terrorists played a role in orchestrating the World Trade Center disaster, but they were only a symptom of the overall problem. The real cause of this tragedy is a psychotic cabal of monstrous globalists who have symbolically stated via this act that the world must now undergo a dramatic change. Listen to me, folks. Everything that we've come to love in this country, all of the cherished freedoms and rights are about to be slowly taken away from us. This is the real thing, and it's happening right before our very eyes. The United States has declared war on terrorists, but there's a much more important war taking place that the media isn't telling you about. It's a war between the globalists, those who want a Slavish New World Order, and a group of patriotic nationalists who love America and want to save it from being destroyed. Let me ask you a question. After the atrocity of September 11th, we witnessed an outpouring of love by hundreds of thousands of honest, dedicated Americans who would do anything to guard and protect our country. These people are everywhere, and it fills my heart with joy to know that they exist. By the same token, take a look at things happening in this country and ask yourself, do the people running the show have the American people's best interest in mind? If you've read any of my past articles in Babel magazine, you'll realize that we're being lied to on a daily basis, duped, deceived, manipulated, and undermined by a hidden cadre of globalists who control our government, media, and universities. If these people want to bolster America, why aren't we being told the truth about the Oklahoma City bombing, the downing of Flight 93, vote scam, AIDS, and scores of other issues? Why are we allowing our country to be overrun with illegal aliens when we could stop this problem within a week? Why are we allowing trade agreements such as NAFTA to destroy our industrial-based economy? Why are we allowing our votes to be stolen by letting self-serving politicians sit in Washington, D.C. and watch us be weakened just so they can fatten their wallets? I'd like to ask you a question. Where do you get your information about the world around you? Most people would say television, radio, newspapers, magazines, and the internet. Let me put this revelation in the starkest terms possible. The same people who are destroying our country are those who own every media source that you get your information from. What does that mean to you? Here's the way I see it. What if I was a thief and wanted to rob your house? In addition to being a burglar, I also publish a newspaper. Knowing I wanted to do something that didn't benefit you, what would I do? Print articles that said I was a thief? Of course not. I wouldn't want you to get even the slightest inkling of my motives. In fact, I'd do anything in my power to keep you in the dark. That is what's happening to us. The media and government are lying through their teeth to the American people on a daily basis. When you tune into the Dan Rather News, it's no different from watching professional wrestling. Neither program is real. Both have predetermined results, and they use a variety of dramatic techniques to hook the viewer. It's time for all of us to think for ourselves rather than be conditioned into obedient little automatons. Read the political articles that appear in this book, then compare them to the lies the corporate media keeps laying on us. There is no comparison. If you don't buy into how much is being kept from us, I'd like to tell you about a group called the Bilderbergs, a revolving group of political leaders, bankers, industrialists, and businessmen who meet once a year to plan the world's future. Of course, considering that these men and women are the most influential individuals on the planet, you'd think there'd be some media coverage of their conferences, but the mainstream media never says a word about them. It's a total blackout. Or, as James Tucker said in the now defunct Spotlight newspaper, if the world's most popular film stars or football players gathered for a closed-door meeting over the weekend, the press would go crazy, demanding to know what was discussed. But when the world's most powerful private citizens gather in the company of key political figures, there's not the slightest cry of outrage. What we have is a handful of people who control virtually all the information we receive. This system is perpetuated by the FCC, which regulates how many television and radio stations operate in a given area. The lockdown is so complete, in 1990 only 21 groups controlled the entirety of the printed media, 12 groups controlled all the newspapers, 3 controlled the magazines, and another 6 controlled the mainstream publishing industry. I guarantee these numbers have become even more appalling over the past decade. Turn on your television and flick through the channels. How many alternatives do you have in regard to the news? There is CBS controlled, NBC controlled, ABC controlled, Fox controlled, CNN controlled, Time Magazine controlled, The New York Times controlled, The Washington Post controlled, Newsweek controlled, U.S. News and World Report controlled. The people who dominate the media are part of the Alibi Club, an elite group of 50 business executives and political officials who have joined together with the intelligence community to influence what we see, hear, and read in the media. This idea is supported by a clandestine program called Operation Mockingbird, in which the CIA recruited and used mainstream journalists to manipulate the media and directly affect the outcome of elections. One of the biggest problems that controllers suffer from is a propensity to reveal their motives every once in a while. So take a look and see what these folks are saying about their own industry and practices. Richard Salant, former president of CBS News. Our job is to give people not what they want, but what we decide they ought to have. End quote. Lyndon Johnson, former president of the United States. Reporters are puppets. They simply respond to the pull of the most powerful strings. End quote. Bill Moyers, television journalist. Most of the news on television is ultimately whatever the government says is news. End quote. Johnny Carson. How much of the national news that you report to the public each night consists of information you've actually gone out and dug up on your own? End quote. Connie Chung, responding to Johnny's question. In all honesty, we are often at the mercy of the White House for the news we report. Frequently, we simply report verbatim what the White House tells us. End quote. The CIA and the cult of intelligence, Marchetti and Marx. Only about 20% of the CIA's career employees work on intelligence analysis and information processing. About 2/3 of all CIA funds and manpower are spent on covert operations, such as the manipulation of public opinion and elections, and its mass media manipulation activity. End quote. As a voice of reason, Noam Chomsky tells us, if you're rational and honest, you're pretty much excluded from the educated classes, from the privileged classes. Those are properties, honesty and rationalism, that are very dangerous. In other words, Chomsky says if you're a liar, you can progress to the upper echelons of power. But if you're honest, you're seen as a threat to the established order. On September 10, 2001, America was plunging into a recession. The Gary Condit sex scandal played on every station, Crime was on an upswing. The Israeli-Palestinian peace talks were deteriorating, and NAFTA and illegal immigration had many people disgruntled. One day later, on September 11th, our nation was inspired by waves of patriotism focused on a single act of brutality, and was willing to relinquish many of our civil rights. To fuel us, George W. Bush gave a speech that sent his approval ratings through the roof. Do you think life has gotten better or worse since September 11th? If you said worse, what are you going to do if things keep going downhill? Also, do you think Dan Rather, the New York Times, and Newsweek are going to be there to help you along the way, or will they continue to lie on a daily basis? I don't know about you, but I refuse to accept their deceptive practices any longer. Chapter 54, The American Media Should Be Ashamed of Itself. In mid-April 2002, the Trilateral Commission met for 4 days at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Washington, D.C. As is their custom, this highly influential group of world leaders from North America, Japan, and Europe plotted ways to promote their globalist agenda. Some of the items on their nefarious list this year were America's upcoming invasion of Iraq and how to lure Europe and other Asian nations into supporting the war machine, the need to further create a multinational financial octopus with the United Nations as the head of a one-world government, a decision to keep pumping money, technology, and computers into China, bolstering them as the next premier global superpower, a decision to funnel more American aid to underexploited foreign countries, leading the way for the implementation of a world tax, prevention of the Israeli-Palestinian war from turning into a complete powder keg, thus endangering our Middle Eastern oil supplies. Each of these issues seems vitally important, even crucial to the world. Others thought so too. For some of the attendees included David Rockefeller, Overlord, Chase Manhattan Bank; Paul Volcker, former chairman, Federal Reserve; Charles Robb, former senator; Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense; Kenneth Lay, former CEO, Enron; Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State; Winston Lord, former China ambassador; David Gergen, editor, U.S. News and World Report; Zbigniew Brzezinski, former head of National Security, Trilateral Commission co-founder; Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State; John Deutsch, former Director, CIA; Richard Holbrooke, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN; Harold Brown, former Secretary of Defense; Strobe Talbot, former Undersecretary of State; Tom Foley, former Speaker of the House. In addition to those in attendance was also the head of Goldman Sachs International, one of the 10 firms that hold the most stock in our nation's Federal Reserve System. Also, there were other representatives from Fuji Xerox, Germany, the U.S. Ambassador; Georgetown professor; Washington Post columnist; Archer Daniel Midland chair; Club of Rome president; International Monetary Fund managing director; Canada, UK former High Commissioner; British Parliament member; AFL-CIO Knight Branch President Emeritus; Federal Reserve President Levi Strauss Chair; Rothschild and Sons Director; Citicorp, which owns 22% of New York FR stock, Vice Chairman; Institution of Global Economics, Seoul, CEO; Mexican government, former President and Minister of Trade; Irish Contingency of Government, former senator. Xerox, former CEO. Some of the speakers and panelists were Dick Cheney, Vice President of the United States, Alan Greenspan, Chairman, Federal Reserve, Colin Powell, Secretary of State, Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense. In all, 251 of the most influential businessmen, statesmen, politicians, financiers, and academics met in Washington, D.C. And how much did you hear about it in your local or national media? I'll bet nothing. Think of it this way. As veteran reporter Jim Tucker of the American Free Press so eloquently puts it, every year when the world's greatest actors get together at the Academy Awards, is the media present? Yes. How about when America's two best football teams meet at the Super Bowl? Is the media there? Of course. TV's Emmy Awards, the media is there. Grammys, media there. The media even reports on hog calling contests at the state fair in Arkansas. But when some of the most powerful men and women congregate to determine the course of future history, did any of the following cover their meeting? ABC, no. NBC, no. CBS, no. New York Times, no. Newsweek, no. Time Magazine, no. The Washington Post and U.S. News and World Report even had journalists present. They should have been running full-color blowout cover story articles on the Trilateral Commission's meeting. Regrettably, they did not. Instead, we got the same old sanitized, censored pabulum that keeps the masses socially controlled and uninformed. In Russia, there used to be an old joke about their two primary newspapers, Pravda, which means truth, and Izvestia, which translates to news. The punchline was, there's no truth in Pravda and no news in Izvestia. All of us in America laugh at that joke because we enjoy freedom of the press and openness in the media, right? Wrong. What differentiates us from the old hardcore Soviets if we're not being told the truth and we don't get the news straight up? Sure, there are alternate sources for information such as the internet and underground press, but the mainstream media in this country should be ashamed of themselves. Again, I'll ask, why do they refuse to give us the whole story? The answer lies in an all-pervasive concept, control. You see, since 5 multinational corporations now own the entirety of the mainstream media in this country, they essentially determine what you see and cannot see or read or hear. With this stranglehold over the media, here's how they control their output. Let's pretend there's a hotshot journalist who graduates from college and lands his first job at a small-town newspaper. Young and idealistic, he writes articles about township council meetings and profiles on little old ladies growing petunias in their backyard. Everything is running smoothly and life is good. Within a year, the young journalist moves on to a small city paper, keeps shining, and soon finds himself writing at a nationally known publication. He gets married, has 2 children, and buys a big house in a nice neighborhood. He even wins a few awards along the way. His future is bright. Then, when all seems settled and cool, this reporter gets tipped off to an incredibly horrendous program that is secretly being implemented against the American people without their knowledge. The reporter, outraged, does some research and discovers what he didn't want to learn. So, with facts in hand and a belly full of bravado to back him up, he storms into his editor's office and lays it all out, telling the editor he wants to expose this obvious injustice. Now, here's where things get sticky. The editor obviously knows what's going on, so he sits the reporter down and tells him frankly that these types of stories cannot be covered because of the potential damage it could cause the controllers. The reporter freaks out and says if his newspaper won't blow the lid off the story, he'll take his notes and sources to another outlet. The editor, who had been through the same routine 20 years earlier, explains to the man that he's a great reporter with tons of potential, but if he pursues this story, he'll be blackballed within the industry. Sure, he might get an underground publication to run his story, but in the mainstream, he'll be all but washed up. That means no more cushy assignments hobnobbing with influential personalities, no more top-notch salary, and no more promotions or vacations in Hawaii. In all likelihood, he'll probably even be canned in the near future if he causes any more trouble. The reporter protests, but his editor tells him to consider the impact on his career. Without the big money rolling in, how can he pay his mortgage, keep his trophy wife and pretties, send their 2 children to private school, and dine at the finest restaurants? He'll go from prince to pauper, get divorced, and all the rest is history. So the reporter goes home and discusses his options with his wife, then returns to work the next day to tell his editor that, yes, he'll can the expose and bury it. Pleased, the editor lets his superiors know his employee is a team player, and soon he gets another promotion. Then, a couple years down the line, the advancing reporter gets an assignment as the executive editor at a mid-sized newspaper. That's when some hotshot citizen comes to him with a story that'll blow the lid off a government scam. They have tons of information, sources, and data, and want the new editor to run their story. By this time, the editor knows how the game is played. He wasn't assigned to this job to report on news that benefits the community. He was put there to keep a lid on everything, to not blow any covers. So the editor tells his higher-ups what's going on and asks how he should handle it. They instruct him to keep cool and cover it up. So the editor puts a dagger through the story and kills it. It's dead, done, and over, and no one's the wiser. The higher-ups are again pleased with our hero for being a team player, and soon he's promoted to editor at a big city paper. The game goes on, and the system stays intact. That's the way it works, but not only in the newspaper business. It's the same in the television industry. Ask Dan Rather. As the chosen reporter for the JFK assassination, he made his entire career by scamming us at that infamous event, and soon replaced Walter Cronkite as the anchor for the CBS Evening News. In politics, if a candidate doesn't toe the line and instead decides to become a whistleblower, all of a sudden the big party machine money from the Republicans and Democrats that had gone to their re-election campaigns suddenly dries up and is funneled to another candidate who is better trained in following the rules. If this candidate insists on trying to expose the inner workings of the machine, the media conveniently uncovers a scandal and the politician is publicly humiliated, ensuring they'll never be re-elected again. Almost all falls from grace are not because a certain politician is any dirtier than the rest. It's because they're bucking the system and trying to disclose graft and underhanded schemes. In academia, if an instructor or professor adheres to the accepted curriculum and doesn't stray or tell the truth, especially in history, political science, economics, archaeology, and the science fields, they're in the running for all the benefits of academic life. But if they venture into forbidden territory, the promotions, cushy conference trips to Florida in January, research money, and tenure fade away into oblivion. In other words, teach what is included within the narrow confines established by the controllers, or else you'll be passed over time and again for someone who is a team player. The same rationale applies to the business world, medical profession, and dog-eat-dog trenches of the legal profession. either conform or get bounced and rejected. Chapter 55, Take Back Your Stolen Vote, Vote Scam Revisited. Whenever a man has cast his eye on office, a rottenness begins in his character. Thomas Jefferson. Those who cast the vote decide nothing. Those who count the votes decide everything. Joseph Stalin. Quiz. During every federal election, do the networks and major newspapers actually send their own reporters and researchers into polling places, scrambling to discern who the potential winners will be so they can be the first to scoop their competitors with the election results? Answer: no. The networks don't compete for vote totals. CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, and Fox all belong to VNS, the Voter News Service, which is a consortium of mass media conglomerates who have pooled their resources and have the exclusive right bestowed by Congress to count the votes in every state. None of them compete for these votes. They all come from the same source, VNS, located at 225 West 34th Street in New York City. In other words, when you watch the drama on each of the network broadcasts, where they're frantically scrambling to be the first to announce a winner, it's nothing but an illusion, a lie. VNS compiles all the data from every election, then posts it simultaneously for each network, plus the major daily newspapers. In fact, both Time Magazine, March 2, 1992, page 22, and Margaret Sims of the Federal Elections Commission Report, 1994, reported that the 6 primary members of this group, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, and Associated Press, received the exact same exit poll information at the same time from the same company. That's why these networks can declare a winner in a multitude of races only 1 minute after the polls close. The Associated Press, June 1, 2001, page A04, even reported that the above 6 media organizations renewed their contract with VNS despite the overwhelming corruption and horror of the 2000 presidential election. Do you see what's happening here? It's all professional wrestling. Why don't rather Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings admit to the American public on election night that there is no drama, no scrambling for data, and no heated competition among them for election results? It all comes from the same source. The answer, regrettably, is that this frantic professional wrestling scenario is a technique or excuse that is needed to steal your vote. If this is the case, some may ask, why haven't we heard about it before? The answer, quite simply, is that you should have, because there are plenty of influential people in the media who know about it, but are simply covering for the controllers. Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes is aware of vote scam, as are Geraldo Rivera, Ross Perot, Janet Reno, Pat Robertson, Ted Turner, Ted Koppel, Larry King, Helen Thomas, Mario Cuomo, Jerry Brown, and the recently deceased Katharine Graham. All of them know our votes are being stolen. Their silence is unforgivable. Before delving into my overview of vote scam, I'd like to provide a few examples of how pervasive and appalling the electoral process is in this country. Following these case histories, we'll take a very hard look at not only the problems confronting us, but also a way to correct the situation. Stolen votes. Example, November 1st. In the 1970 Dade County, Florida election, Jim and Ken Collier, authors of Vote Scam, found that 3 minutes after the polls had closed, all of the major networks had already projected the winners in over 250 races. Only 1 minute after the polls had closed, Channel 7 projected that a certain candidate would not only win, but would receive 96,499 total votes. When the official results were returned, guess how many votes this candidate received? 96,499. Channel 7 was 100% accurate only 1 minute after the voting had ended. The Collier brothers went one step further and tracked down all the projections versus the actual results for all major Florida races in 1970. Here is what they found. Race, governor, projected 141,387. Actual 141,866. Senate 43. Projected 45,696. Actual 45,881. House 98. Projected 97,031. Actual 96,499. House 10. Projected 67,940. Actual 68,491. House 107. Projected 81,802. Actual 81,539. The question we have to ask is, how can the networks not only be so accurate, but arrive at these startling projections 1 to 3 minutes after the polls close? Think about it. After the voting stations close at 9 p.m., what needs to be done? Tens of thousands of punch card ballots need to be collected. Then they must be fed into a punch card reader. Now, I know what this process entails because I operated an entire room full of IBM mainframe computers during the mid-1980s, back when punch cards were still in use. To read even a few drawers of cards was quite an ordeal, considering all the misfeeds, jams, etc. Anyway, after all the cards are read and the data needs to be compiled, organized, printed out, then transmitted to the television station where it'll be prepped for broadcast. You think all of these steps can be completed in 1 to 3 minutes? The Collier brothers found it very implausible, so they went to Channel 7 and tried to track down the supercomputer that made these projections only 1 to 3 minutes after the polls closed, all with 99 to 100% accuracy. The first thing they wanted to know was which reporter called in the raw totals to the television station. They were told that it wasn't a reporter after all, but a member of the League of Women Voters. Since only a handful of reporters could be out in the field, considering that this was only an affiliate station, it would seem illogical that only a few precincts could be sampled. But how, they wondered, could 99% of the precincts be reporting by 11 o'clock, only 2 hours after the polls closed? The League of Women Voters must be incredibly efficient. So the Colliers visited Joyce Defendorfer, head of the local League of Women Voters, and asked for a list of all the people who had counted votes on election night, since Channel 7 said that's where they got their results. Realizing the cat was out of the bag, Miss Diffendorfer, in tears, admitted that there weren't any LWV members in any of the precincts that night. They hadn't counted a single vote, and she didn't want to get caught up in this thing. Within 3 minutes of the polls closing, the TV station had projections that were 99 to 100% accurate, and within 2 hours, 99% of all the precincts had supposedly reported their results. It's funny because no one was able to locate the supercomputer that made these fabulous projections, nor could anyone be found that even counted or reported the vote counts. I wonder where all the numbers came from. Example number 2. In a 1973 Florida election, Print-O-Matic voting machines had been installed to make the entire process run smoother. All of the Print-O-Matic devices have a locked area in back that every election supervisor is supposed to check before the election to ensure that all the wheels were set at 0. but all the keys had been taken away from the supervisor, so none of the totals could be verified. Shortly after the polls opened, the paper rolls began to jam in all the machines, making them inoperable. Since no one could vote, the backs of each device were eventually opened, and when the paper rollers were pulled out, they all had the final vote totals already printed on them at 7 o'clock in the morning. Needless to say, every election volunteer walked off the job. Example number 3. If you think voter fraud only happened during Al Capone's Chicago days, do you recall their helpful hint, vote early and vote often? You are seriously mistaken. Here are a few other tricks of the trade. 1. Shave the wheels in the back of a voting machine so they skip ahead. 2. Before they open, unlock the back of a voting device and set the total counters ahead for a certain candidate. 3. If a clear ballot box isn't used, stuff it with pre-punched vote cards before the polls open. 4. If a computerized machine is used, unplug it or turn it off so all the previous totals are erased. Finally, the League of Women Voters has been captured on videotape in Florida with pencils and tweezers punching out cards for certain candidates, then shoving them into ballot boxes. The list could go on forever. Example number 4. Finally, during the 1996 Republican Party primary, Pat Robertson was beating every other candidate in the early stages of the race, especially Bob Dole and Steve Forbes. Then, when he rolled into Arizona with high hopes of another victory that would catapult him toward getting his party's nomination, something strange happened. The computers broke down. Yes, VNS had actually declared Buchanan the winner. Karen Johnson, Buchanan's Arizona state coordinator, got a call from Governor Fife Symington congratulating her on what he called a decisive victory. Senator John McCain also drafted a congratulatory letter, while all 3 networks and CNN said that Dole would definitely finish third, while Forbes took second and Buchanan won. The computers mysteriously went down. When they came back up, guess what happened? Pat Buchanan ended up a distant third, while Bob Dole won. When asked about this phenomenon, Buchanan joked about the computers, referring to the fix being in. They seemed to work better after they brought them back. Voter News Service, VNS. As mentioned, VNS is the only American company that counts votes in every federal election. Ponder this point for a moment. A faceless corporation that 99% of the people in this country have never heard of is responsible for tabulating our votes. This service was created by the Big Six in 1964, 1 year after JFK was assassinated, and is currently run by ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, and AP. Over the years, VNS has gone through a variety of name changes and was originally called NES, News Election Service. When you consider the ramifications of every presidential, congressional, and gubernatorial race, you'll see that VNS is one of the most influential corporations in America. Yet no one has ever heard of them. How can such a fantastic responsibility be placed in the hands of a company that was developed by a consortium of corporate media conglomerates? The most glaring observation one could make from this situation is, if a faceless, unknown agency, VNS, is the sole vote counter rather than accountable local volunteers in each precinct, is it conceivable that a wealthy politician or political party could clandestinely pay them off and rig an election? The answer is obvious, especially when 99% of the American people don't even know about the existence of VNS. Robert H. Land, professor of law at the University of Baltimore, in a letter dated October 22, 2000, to the United States Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission on behalf of the American Antitrust Institute said, the government should file suit to break up the VNS. He continued, shortly after the 2000 fall election, why the uniformity of wrong results? This can be explained by a lack of competition. All of the competing major networks are actually colluding with one another, and they call their collusion the VNS. Finally, Mr. Landy concludes, if the 6 largest manufacturers of automobiles, canned food, or aluminum decided to close existing operations and pool resources to save money, the antitrust enforcement agencies would be after them immediately. End quote. Network news reporting. When you're dealing with the networks, you're dealing with a shadow government. Tim O'Brien, ABC's Supreme Court correspondent. On Monday, November 2nd, 1988, the night before the off-year elections, ABC News posted hundreds of election results, one whole day before a single person ever placed a vote. Now that we know the networks CNN, Fox, and AP all get their election results from the same source, VNS, we need to ask ourselves, why is there such an emphasis on speed? Speed is the key, at least where the networks are concerned. Why? Because the illusion of reporting speedy results is the second piece of the puzzle needed to steal an election. I'll give you the first piece a little later. Here's a typical scenario. Dan Rather appears on your TV screen at 1 minute after the hour, 1 minute after the polls have closed in a certain part of the country. Naturally, he'll already have some projections, and he'll even announce some winners 1 minute after the polls close. So they'll rack up their totals, show who is ahead, and focus their attention on the last intangible, those races that are too close to call. Once you hear those words, you know you're in trouble. That's when there's a huge gap in reporting, the lag time, when Dan Rather talks to all his boys to get their expert opinion. Of course, not once is he mentioning that all their results are coming from VNS. That information isn't important enough for the American people to know. Then, all of a sudden, one of two things happens. First, there are either technical difficulties or else the computers break down. If you don't believe me, hearken back to the Florida debacle in 2000. After a while, the network head will report either a huge landslide of results with one candidate pulling way ahead, or else the difficulty was corrected and there was a drastic turnaround in votes with the candidate in front falling far behind, or vice versa. But speed is the key ingredient. While the polling place is closing down 1 minute after the hour and punch cards or computer data is being transferred to county headquarters, then onward to VNS, none of it can be verified or made official. A perfect example would be the 2000 Iowa caucus. With over 2,000 polling places, the AP announced a winner 1 minute after the caucus had opened, not closed, and not one vote had been cast. Think about how absurd these examples are. ABC News is reporting election results a day before an election, and the AP is announcing winners before any votes are not only analyzed, but even cast. Polling. The first ingredient needed to assure the desired results from a particular election is the use of polls and exit polls. Before I continue, I'd like to make one thing perfectly clear. The poll results that you see on the nightly news and in your local paper on a daily basis are nothing but a conditioning tool used to make the general public think the proper way. In other words, the supposed polls you see every night on the world news do nothing but mold opinion, not mirror it. The concept is similar to the psychological test in which 20 plants are told to say that a certain flashcard is colored red when in reality it is purple. When the 21st person is finally asked what color the card is, they've been so conditioned to think it's purple because everyone else said so. They go against their own natural inclinations and answer incorrectly. Actually, a more appropriate psychological term for this process is called psychic driving. To acclimate the voting public on how they're supposed to react, a specific message is repeatedly hammered into their heads on a daily basis. Are you starting to see how this little game is played? First, we're set up with public opinion polls, which are nothing but an outright farce and do not in any way indicate how we truly feel. All the numbers are cooked. But this con job plays a very important role by getting us ready for who the controllers have decided will win in a particular election. After the stage has been set by repeatedly saying that candidate X is ahead in the polls by 10 points, even though they may only have a 20% favorable rating by the voting public, we are now ready for stage 2, the lightning-fast projections and exit poll results. Exit polls, I hope you know by now, are even shadier than the pre-election surveys. Why? Because it's one last chance to condition the public and prepare them for who the winner will be. As a side note, exit polls also play a large part in lessening the impact that voters in Western states play in determining who will ultimately emerge as the victor. As we have already discovered, none of the networks scramble to get election results. All of their information comes from the exact source at the exact same time, VNS. If they have already admitted this fact, although they do so quietly as possible, then within 1 minute of the polls closing, the networks project a winner based on exit polls that are startling in their accuracy, with only 1% of the vote actually in. The next logical question to ask at this point is, if the networks aren't running around frantically doing election day exit polling, then who is? The answer, an outfit called VRS, Voter Research Surveys. Now try to guess who operates VRS. You're right, the same Big Six media conglomerates that run VNS. Before we go any further, the networks would say, wait a minute, there is an organization that overlooks VNS called the NCCP, the National Council of Public Polls. These folks guarantee that everything is on the up and up. I must admit there is indeed an organization called the NCCP that is made up of a consortium of pollsters and news outlets. But guess what? The same media members who founded VNS also belong to the NCCP. Pretty convenient, huh? So between the networks VNS, VRS, and NCCP, we have polls, exit polls, then finally those remarkable projections that are almost always right on the mark. But how can their estimates always be so close to what the final tabulated results are? That's easy. All the election supervisors have to do is doctor the computer numbers to match the exit polls. Then they come up with what was already a predetermined result in the first place. How do you think we keep getting all these asinine politicians in office, the same ones who stay there forever, especially when everyone hates them? We sure as hell aren't voting for them, at least if there's another choice. The picture is becoming a little clearer, isn't it? Computerized voting. In an election totally free of fraud, citizens would handwrite their votes on paper ballots, place them in a clear box, then watch as an impartial group of volunteers counted their votes in full view. The results would then be posted at the polling place before being shipped to the county courthouse. With computerized voting, we simply send a blip through cyberspace. There is no paper trail, a physical ballot, nor are there any checks and balances. We're simply told to trust those in charge of the election and everything will be okay. Considering the evidence I've provided thus far, how much faith does that inspire in you? What if we found that it's possible to manipulate these computerized, unseen results to correspond to the projections, also doctored, that were given 1 minute after the polls close, so that everything would be official? What if someone told you, hey, it'd be very easy to find a computer programmer who could write some software that would already determine the winner regardless of the vote totals? The procedure wouldn't be much more difficult to pull off than placing a paper roller into the back of a print-o-matic voting machine that already had the totals pre-printed on them. Now, I'm sure someone will say that this notion is preposterous. To prove the process isn't corrupt, all the software designers have to do is show you the source code from their program. How complicated could it be to write a program that simply counts votes? Any 10th grade kid who has taken an introductory course in computer science could write it. But guess what? Numerous researchers have tried to inspect the computer software at VNS, but instead of gladly allowing them to do so, these are fair and open elections, aren't they? VNS flatly denied their request, saying their programs were trade secrets. In other words, their software is afforded the same protection as any other corporate trade secret. To me, the same rationale doesn't apply for two reasons. One, that is very influential in determining who will assume the presidency and a large number of congressional seats. My second argument is just as straightforward. What do these software designers have to hide? They haven't created programs that prevent America from being bombed by incoming ballistic missiles like those used at NORAD. The only thing supposedly their software does is count votes. Why all the secrecy? Why don't they want anyone inspecting their source codes? On the night before the 1988 presidential election, the following conversation took place on the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather, realistically, could the fix be put on in a national election? Howard J. Strauss, computer expert, Princeton University. Get me a job with a company that writes the software for this program. Then I'd have access to 1/3 of their votes. Of the votes. Is that enough to fix a general election? Mr. Strauss also said, when it comes to computerized elections, there are no safeguards. It's not a door without locks. It's a house without doors. Judge Richard Nyhouse, in a 1985 ruling against the Cincinnati Board of Elections, there is no adequate and proper safeguard against the computers being programmed to distort the election results. Eva Waskell, an election researcher for over 10 years, weighed in with this observation. One major problem is that computer codes that run the machines are protected as trade secrets, which makes it very hard to have an election independently audited. She also added, the election industry is virtually unregulated. There are no mandatory regulations or standards for accurately recording and counting votes. End quote. Craig C. Donsanto, Deputy Attorney in the Justice Department, warned us in a July 4, 1989 edition of the Los Angeles Times, you have to have access and some degree of technical knowledge to penetrate an electronic tabulating system. Most of them have been or will be simply because voting is the way we determine who gets power in this country. The following is a quote from the same Los Angeles Times article on voter fraud, 7/4 of '89. Some critics of computerized vote counting worry about the potential for trap doors, time bombs, and Trojan horses. A computer operator with the correct password could place a trap door or a series of hidden vote counting instructions inside the system, according to Election Watch report. Once into the system, the operator could program the computer to count votes for one candidate as votes for another. After the votes have been changed to swing the election, the trap door could be closed. In a letter, Attorney Ellis Rubin, 324 of 92, described to Attorney General William Barr how to rig computerized voting. Anyone with access codes could punch into elections and change the results, and nobody would be the wiser. That also goes for the software involved. As you can readily see, many people from different walks of life are worried about the real dangers associated with computerized voting. It's clear that we've opened a Pandora's box. The only question now is it too late to close the lid, or have all the evils already escaped? JFK and Watergate. Since we've come this far, many people might be wondering, how could we have allowed what was once the world's greatest democratic process to be tainted by the likes of VNS, computers, and the corporate media? According to famed researcher Mae Brussel, whom the Collier brothers quote in Vote Scam, the roots of this atrocity can be traced directly to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. After Kennedy was killed in 1963 and the Warren Report came out shortly thereafter, everybody, the media included, knew its claims were so preposterous that they bordered on ridiculous. Any mainstream journalist worth their weight in salt could have blown the lid off that story in 5 minutes. So those in control knew they needed to scramble fast to keep the genie in the bottle. So the CIA, who was very instrumental in orchestrating JFK's demise, made a deal with the press. If they kept the lid on this ruse, they would get control of the vote count in every upcoming election. Vote Scam is nothing more than a trade-off between the media and the power brokers. The Warren Report was a complete load of bull. Lee Harvey Oswald never fired a shot, as reported by the Air Force Staff College and American University. The FBI, CIA, and various media heads met in 1964 and came to an agreement. If the media bigwigs didn't expose the obvious lies about JFK's assassination, they could become the nation's official vote counters and source for election results. 1963, JFK was killed. In 1964, News Election Service, NES, was founded by the networks AP and UPI. If anyone doesn't believe the controllers placed a tremendous amount of heat on the media to cover the Warren Report lies, then check out CIA document number 1035-960. Quote, "We do not recommend discussion of the assassination question where it is already not taking place. Where discussion is active, however, addresses are requested. To discuss the publicity problem with liaison and friendly elite contacts, especially politicians and editors, pointing out that the Warren Commission made as thorough an investigation as humanly possible, and that further speculative discussion only plays into the hands of the opposition. Point out that parts of the conspiracy talk appear to be deliberately generated by communist propagandists. Urge them to use their influence to discourage unfounded and irresponsible speculation. To employ propaganda assets to answer and refute the attacks of the critics. Book reviews and feature articles are particularly appropriate for this purpose." End quote. It's fairly evident why the controllers would want to conceal the truth about the Warren Report. But why were the spooks so enraged by JFK in the first place? The answer can be found in a statement that Kennedy uttered shortly before his death. It appears that he was so disgusted by the Secret Service and its nefarious practices justices, he vowed to shatter it into a million pieces and scatter it to the wind. When threatened, the CIA reacts. JFK went for their throat, so he ended up with a bullet in his head a couple months later. The assassination was messy and a number of mistakes were made. To compensate for their obvious errors, ex-CIA founder and director Alan Dulles met secretly with Chief Justice Earl Warren and told him if their committee didn't bamboozle the American public, world peace would be in grave danger. So, what happened? In November 1963, control of this country was ultimately handed over to the shadow powers, to the CIA, CFR, and the secret societies that lurk behind the curtain. Earl Warren put out a fluff report packed with lies that is still maintained by CIA disinformation to this day. Earl Warren buckled to Alan Dulles, thus tainting his image for all time, and subsequently selling a large part of his soul for eternity. It seems that vote fraud not only took on greater importance with the Kennedy assassination, but also extended all the way to Watergate. Katharine Graham, a media powerhouse and ruling queen tyrant of the Washington Post, also owned a television station in Florida that was well aware of the vote scam allegations made by Jim and Ken Collier. After the brothers shouted their news to whomever would listen, Richard Nixon and his cronies found out about their evidence. Since Nixon was never a fan of the media, especially the Washington Post, he laid the hammer down on Katharine Graham by threatening to revoke her FCC license at the TV station because she ignored such an abundance of vote scam evidence. Backed into a corner, Miss Graham stumbled onto an insignificant break-in at the Watergate Hotel and turned it into a huge scandal that eventually destroyed Tricky Dick. The story is much more complex, but what essentially happened was that the media, when threatened and forced to cover their tracks, asserted their power by railroading a sitting president out of office. The octopus-like arms of vote scam keep extending outward. Solutions. Do you trust the corporate media in this country to be completely honest and forthright with you? If you answered yes to this question, then you don't need to read any further because you obviously don't think we have a problem with the type of information the citizens of this country are receiving. But if you answered in the negative, all I can say is, if the media isn't being 100% honest with you in regard to the information it disseminates, how can we trust them with something as important as counting the votes in all of our major elections? Think for a minute to whom we've given this responsibility. Believe me, the people who run the show aren't stupid. In fact, they're brilliant in their ingenious deceitfulness. And until we call them on it, they're going to keep snowing us like they've always done. In the 1988 presidential election, CBS was the first to call George Bush the winner at 9:17 p.m., only 17 minutes after the polls closed, with voting stations still open in the western states. What I'd like to know is, why the rush? We elect the president in early November, and he's not inaugurated until mid-January, over 2 months later. Why do we need to prematurely announce a winner after only 17 minutes? It takes county officials at least a month to verify all the vote totals. Are we so greedy for results that we're willing to sacrifice the very sanctity of our democratic process for the ruse of speed that the networks are leading us to believe? Look at what we've done. The United States government doesn't tabulate a single vote, thank God, in any of the gubernatorial, congressional, or presidential elections. But since this snake isn't involved in the process, we hand over the responsibility to a demon beast that's equally as hideous. To add insult to injury, 60% of all the votes in this country are now classified as computerized votes. That means we can't see them or physically count them. We have to simply trust that VNS does everything properly in their invisible little clandestine world. With the above premise in mind, I'm going to let you in on the most crucial secrets of our current age. Here it is. Do you know what scares the hell out of the controllers more than anything? Answer: that a renegade candidate will emerge on the scene who rallies and inspires the people to such an extent that he or she steamrolls into the presidency and exposes the big lie. The controllers spend practically every waking moment trying to prevent this scenario. You see, if this maverick candidate gets into office, the whole house of cards will tumble. It'll be exactly like the Wizard of Oz. Do you remember how feeble, horrified, and in awe Dorothy and her cohorts were when they first entered Oz? The entirety of this huge, cumbersome, all-encompassing kingdom literally reduced them to trembling little saps. But then the veil was removed. After that, the wizard would never be able to rule over them with such terrifying brilliance as before. The controllers will do anything in their power to keep from being exposed, and I'll tell you, it wouldn't take much to do the job. Think about it. A candidate who is truly of, for, and by the people would go on TV and say, guess what? These guys have been deceiving you for years. Here is how. Then this renegade would go down the line and say, this is a lie, this is a lie, this is a lie, this is a lie. And here is how we're going to change things. From that point forward, heads would start rolling, and the controllers who have been plotting and deceiving us for at least a century or more would stand like horrified deer in the headlights of a locomotive as their con job was brought out into the open. The above scenario is the key to what's happening in the world right now. The controllers obsess over every aspect of keeping the lid on their scam, from newscasts to mind control to elections. The thought of a renegade candidate who cares about the people and tells them the truth makes them wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, shivering with fear. All it would take is one stinking revelation of truth and the whole game is over. Do you get it? If given the opportunity, one person can change the world. If this candidate did speak to us, the controller's vision of a one-world hellish government would go down the drain in a heartbeat. To combat this scenario from ever coming to fruition, the controllers need to do one thing: never allow one of those renegade candidates to get into office. So what did they do? They know how sick everyone is of their corrupt two-party system. Actually, it's nothing more than one snake with two heads. So they rigged the election process. Here is how the system currently operates. If punch card ballots are used after everyone votes and the polls close, the results are either taken to county headquarters or shipped directly to VNS without verification. If voting is done by computer, the machines are linked directly to the VNS supercomputers via phone lines so they can interact. Then, minutes after the polls close, the networks project a winner based on supposed exit polls. Within a day or so, everything's swept under the rug, and then they have a month or two to make the actual results jive with the projections. This, my friends, is called a fix. Now get this, the Florida hanging Chad debacle in the 2000 presidential election was vitally important for one very calculated reason. It made the voters so sick of punch card ballots that sometime soon a politician in Washington, D.C. will come out and save us by sponsoring a bill that will put computers in every polling place across America. By touting how easy, fast, and reliable these computers are, they'll get the propaganda machine rolling and convince us that this idea will be our salvation. But when you look past their veil of lies, here's what will happen to put the fix in. As things stand now, especially with punch cards or hand ballots, it still takes an enormous amount of people to be corrupted. Election supervisors, volunteers, etc. But if we switch to 100% computerized voting, think how easy it'll be to throw an election. You'd only need to bribe or pay off one or two programmers in the whole country instead of countless county and party officials. With one centralized computer existing in an invisible realm with programs that can't be checked due to trade secrets, we'll never actually have a chance to see our ballots firsthand. We'll simply push a button, send our vote through cyberspace, then place our trust in VNS, sleazy programmers, and the corporate media. Here is the solution. Instantly abolish VNS and exit polling. If the networks insist on perpetrating the status quo in light of the potential and outright evidence of voter fraud, bring charges of criminal negligence, fraud, and abuse of trust against them. Also, revoke their broadcast license. If this course of action doesn't work, convict them on the RICO Act for racketeering and conspiracy. The American people could bring a class action lawsuit against them, similar to the tobacco company cases, for unduly influencing the outcome of an election. If we don't inherently trust the information being fed to us by the networks and corporate media due to their constant lies and manipulation, how can we place our faith in them to be honest with something as important as the election process? Require positive picture ID when voting. Allow only American citizens to vote. Change the voting day to Saturday. Institute Vote Tracker. Vote Tracker is a computerized touchscreen voting system that is accessed by a personalized voter ID card that allows every person to confirm their vote. Here is how it works. Vote Tracker is a standalone machine that is not connected to any external communication network. Thus, it can't be hacked. Since there are no modems or phone lines, outside forces can't clandestinely intrude and tamper with the results. Once a person votes, they will receive a numbered printed receipt. At the polling place, each voter can then check their numbered receipt against a printout that is posted at each voting station. By doing this, they'll be able to ensure that their votes weren't switched somewhere along the line. Also, Vote Tracker will make it much easier to vote for a write-in candidate as opposed to the extremely difficult current situation. To make it more conducive to vote for write-in candidates, we can more readily lessen the stranglehold of the two-party system. All results would be tabulated, verified, and confirmed at each polling place before they are sent to the county courthouse or onto a VNS-type institution. That's it. No rigging, no hanging chads, no telephone lines, or unverifiable hidden computer programs. This is all we need to do to put the election of public officials back into the people's hands. The big question now is, do we want to take these rather simple steps, or do we want to allow the networks and VNS to keep operating as usual? If we do nothing, I guarantee that the long-awaited candidate who tells us the truth will never be given an opportunity to speak. Instead, we'll be stuck with the same crooked politicians that have already sickened us to no end. Here's the bottom line. The corporate media has to toe a fine line between perpetuating the controllers' lies and trying to maintain their credibility. If we quit believing them, guess what? The show is over. They've lost their ability to influence us any longer. The media has already lost their credibility. Look at the JFK assassination. Almost 40 years later, they're still perpetrating the same bogus story that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone nut assassin. Now they've stolen our vote too. But we can finally see through their lies. The Wizard of Oz has been exposed. Are we going to keep letting them snow us, or will we take steps to elect that candidate who will level with us and get rid of all the corruption? Time is running out. The New World Order isn't something that's going to happen in the future. It's already here. It's now or never. Taking back our vote is the first step toward taking back our country. Chapter 56, Mainstream Media Cowardice, an overview of Into the Buzzsaw. Fact: excluding home ownership, the wealthiest 10% of Americans own 76% of this nation's net worth. More than half of that is accounted for by the top 1%. These rich elitists also own television stations, newspapers, magazines, internet news sites, and radio stations. Whenever I see a preponderance of lies, half-truths, censorship, and steady streams of disinformation in the various media outlets each day, I ask myself, how can these people continue to sell their souls? How do they possibly look in the mirror after knowingly enabling drug traffickers, murderers, and sexual deviants to get away with their crimes? And I'm not even referring to true life criminals. I'm talking about politicians, government officials, intelligence operatives, and the controllers themselves. How can any member of the mainstream media sleep at night, pat their children on the head, or not cringe with shame when they pass an American flag, knowing that a plethora of blatant crimes go unreported each day? Into the Buzzsaw, an excellent book recently released in 2002 by Prometheus Books and edited by Christina Borgeson, answers some of those questions. By giving 18 different journalists a chance to speak freely on a number of issues as opposed to being muted by the corporate media, this collection shows how the field of professional journalism has lost its fire and why its members continue to wallow like yellow-spined lemmings in pools of aloofness and deceit. If you think I'm being too harsh, start reading this book. You'll find an overwhelming amount of evidence that proves not only that our military shot down TWA Flight 800 off the coast of Long Island and commanded ships in the area to speed away, thus avoiding blame, but also that the mainstream media continues to cover for these murderers to this day. The CIA has admitted to blatant cases of cocaine trafficking, yet our fine lily-livered journalists don't have the guts to expose these drug dealers in a meaningful way. Read about the Franklin pedophilia case, AIDS as a man-made genocidal disease, Bilderberg secrecy, vote scam, Federal Reserve deception, and theft, and the mysterious death count surrounding the Clintons. What it boils down to is this: many of the devils in positions of power have intimidated the American mass media journalists to such an extent that they now tremble and cover for these killers, drug dealers, and deviants. Why? Why are they enabling them to get away with this deception? Isn't it time to stand up and expose these traitors? Into the Buzzsaw brings to light what those in power want to conceal. When a reporter dares to trespass into forbidden territory, the truth, they enter the buzzsaw, which Christina Borgeson defines as a powerful system of censorship in this country that is revealed to those reporting on extremely sensitive stories, usually having to do with high-level government and or corporate malfeasance. Borgeson continues to describe the buzzsaw as what can rip through you when you try to investigate or expose anything this country's large institutions, be they corporate or government, want kept under wraps. The system finally fights back with official lies, disinformation, and stonewalling. If the reporter or writer in question cannot be silenced, then media bigwig moguls who are merely pawns of the multinational corporations and international bankers use a technique called marginalization. In other words, when someone gets too close to the truth, they are labeled a conspiracy nut, then subjected to a propaganda juggernaut, which Borgeson says happens to anyone who didn't believe the government officials or the journalists who unquestionably reported what the officials said. She further explains, if you don't go along with the party line, you're shoved into the margins and eventually out of the picture. What does that mean? Simply that the media is towing the party line. If you, as a reporter, walk outside the accepted parameters, they will turn on you like bloodthirsty sharks. Rather than going after the guilty party, they attack the reporter who upset the apple cart. See Gary Webb and his expose on how the CIA imported drugs into LA during the mid-1980s to start the gang war crack craze. Philip Weiss reinforces this point by saying that we do have freedom of speech and freedom of the press in this country. But to combat the dangers inherent to the elite class, it is marginalized by the enforcers to the fringe. Weiss goes on to tell us, corporate media outlets cannot entertain serious questions about the legitimacy of the powers that be, even when spokesmen are shown to lie. Differently, the American media is extremely conservative in nature because stability is much desired and the status quo reigns supreme above all. To validate this statement, Weiss observes, most well-paid reporters are urban liberals firmly ensconced in the blue zone, physically and culturally. By being comfortable and removed from the streets, isn't it interesting how an entire industry of left-leaning journalists is enveloped by a conservative corporate framework? The worst part is that most don't even realize the irony of how shackled and enslaved they are. This strategy doesn't only apply to newspapers or TV. The publishing industry also censors itself. As Gerald Colby points out with the concept of privishing, the phenomenon occurs when a publisher kills off an author's book without the author's awareness or consent. Basically, they cut off the book's life support system. Publishers can plunge a dagger through the heart of a book in a number of different ways, such as 1. Reducing the print run, 2. Refusing additional print runs, 3. Gouging the promotional budget, 4. Failing to support a book signing tour, 5. Or by simply saying that a book is not available. One may wonder at this time how the corporate media is allowed to get away with such nonsense. The key word here is corporate. As Ben Bagdikian notes in The Media Monopoly, in 1993 there were 50 major media corporations in America. Less than 10 years later, there are 6. 6 multinational companies now control all the network, newspaper, radio, and magazine news departments in this country. The corporations, of course, are owned and beholden to the international bankers, whose primary goal is globalization, which is reflected in their foreign policy decisions. In all, the media becomes a conditioning tool used to maintain the status quo while maximizing profits. Greg Palast reflects on the result of this monopolized media. If the Rupert Murdochs of the globe are shepherds of the New World Order, they owe their success to breeding a flock of docile sheep, snoozy editors and reporters who are content to munch on, digest, and then reprint a diet of press releases and canned stories provided by officials and corporate PR operators. Maurice Murad adds, the manipulation of perception is replacing reality as the governing principle in human affairs. When President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered his farewell speech in 1961 before leaving office, he warned Americans about the dangers of a growing military-industrial complex. The media should act as a watchdog against these forces, but instead the press has actually been meshed together with them under the same corporate umbrella. Look at how many of these cowering dogs still refer to Lee Harvey Oswald as JFK's lone nut assassin and rarely acknowledge how horribly their ranks have been corrupted and poisoned by the perpetuation of outright lies. Maurice Murad adds, the manipulation of perceptions is replacing reality as the governing principle in human affairs. When President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered his farewell speech in 1961 before leaving office, he warned Americans about the dangers of a growing military-industrial complex. The media should act as a watchdog against these forces, but instead the press has actually been meshed together with them under the same corporate umbrella. Look at how many of these cowering dogs still refer to Lee Harvey Oswald as JFK's lone nut assassin and rarely acknowledge how horribly their ranks have been corrupted and poisoned by the perpetuation of outright lies. What do I mean? The New York Times came clean once in 1977 and verified to what extent the CIA had infiltrated the media and publishing industry. Author Michael Levine weighs in by saying, if the CIA is good at anything, it is complete control of the American media. So secure are they in their ability to manipulate the media that they even brag about it in their own in-house memos. Gary Webb adds further ammunition by writing, the National News Organization have had a long disappointing history of playing footsie with the CIA. Webb then asks, do we have a free press today? Sure we do. It's free to report all the sex scandals at once, all the stock market news we can handle, every new health fad that comes down the pike, and every celebrity marriage or divorce that happens. But when it comes to the real down and dirty stuff, that's where we begin to see the limits of our freedoms. In today's media environment, sadly, such stories are not even open for discussion. George Seldes, author of Lords of the Press, 1983, lays it all on the line by sneering, it is possible to fool all the people all of the time when government and the press cooperate. Unfortunately, we've reached that point in this country. Most everyone is being bamboozled. In essence, the American media's cowardice is a direct reflection of their don't rock the boat mentality, starting with the editors, program directors, and network heads, and filtering down to the reporters. By utilizing bias, omission, underreporting, and outright censorship, they remain beholden to corporate and local advertising, while preserving their incestuous relationship with governmental PR sources. These two forces make sick, twisted bed partners. The question I keep asking is, how can these guilty parties live with themselves? Are the few dollars they get for keeping the lid on really worth it? Carl Jensen reinforces this point quite nicely by writing, the high salaries many of our leaders receive in newsrooms and business offices as well as corporate headquarters have turned into golden handcuffs, and those handcuffs morphed into blindfolds and gags. Jensen goes on to describe how this failure to break free from their constraints leads to a journalistic conundrum. The United States has a free press guaranteed by its Constitution. It has the world's most sophisticated communication system, and it has more independent media outlets disseminating more information 24 hours a day than anywhere else in the world. Considering our autonomous press and the quality of information that bombards us daily, we should be a very well-informed populace. Unfortunately, high tech and a free press do not guarantee a well-informed society. The problem is not the quantity of information that we receive, but the quality. With this in mind, we should look at the main function of journalism. Robert McChesney provides an excellent overview. The media system must provide a rigorous accounting of people in power and people who want to be in power in both public and private sectors. This is known as the watchdog role. McChesney continues, contemporary journalism serves as a tepid and weak-kneed watchdog over those in power, especially in the corporate sector. But these watchdogs have turned into simpering lapdogs that suckle at the tit of their corporate sponsors, while those who speak the truth are shoved to the fringe or viewed as rabble-rousers and subversives. But let's keep in mind the reality of the situation, of which Henry Adams reminds us. The press is the hired agent of a moneyed system set up for no other reason than to tell lies where their interests are concerned. Robert McChesney explodes one of the prevailing myths of journalism. Trained editors and reporters are granted autonomy by the owners to make editorial decisions, and these decisions are based on their professional judgment, not the politics of the owners and the advertisers, or their commercial interests to maximize profits. How laughable. Closer to the truth, of course, is McChesney's summary of public relations in regard to the media. By providing slick press releases, paid-for experts, neutral-sounding but bogus citizen groups, and canned news events, crafty PR agents have been able to shift the news to suit the interests of their mostly corporate clientele. Alex Carey, who wrote Taking the Risk Out of Democracy in 1997, adds weight to this argument by showing how these smarmy shysters add another level of confusion to America's social fabric. The role of PR is to so muddle the public sphere as to take the risk out of democracy for the wealthy and corporations. In other words, the media, when combined with public relations firms and their overlord controllers, end up conditioning us with a game of misdirection. Sort of like children when they played hot or colder. You're getting hotter, hotter, now colder. By using a variety of subtle techniques, the media directs us away from stories they deem too hot or explosive. Robert McChesney describes professional journalism as being biased toward the status quo. The general rule in journalism is this: if the elite, the upper 2 or 3% of society who control most of the capital and rule the largest institutions, agree on an issue, then it is off limits to journalistic scrutiny. McChesney continues, to the United States elite, democracy tends to be defined by their ability to maximize profit. He also adds, U.S. professional journalism, even at its best, serves as a propaganda function, similar to the role of Pravda or Izvestia in the old USSR. If we return to media ownership, we see that our faithful television broadcasters are essentially controlled by AOL, Time Warner, Disney, Viacom, GE, and Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. Also, check out these disturbing facts. The 10 largest media firms own all U.S. TV networks. They also own most every TV station in the major markets, all major film and music studios, nearly all the TV cable channels, and most all book and magazine publishers. In terms of news, Jim Squires, former editor of the Chicago Tribune, found this trend so disturbing, he said resentfully, "Our generation has witnessed the end of journalism. As it stands now, the American media has relinquished its role as watchdogs of the high and mighty, therein surrendering their dignity and ability to help make the world a better place. And what a pitiful, disheartening surrender it has been, to not only themselves and their families, but also to the American public. This once proud, vital institution has allowed itself to be reduced to pathetic marionettes dangling from the controller's strings. The profession has, by and large, lost its backbone and grit. Hell, they'll even bend over for the international financiers and whip us into a frenzy so the deathmongers can ship our boys off to die in another one of their perpetual wars." McChesney sums up the media's role in fueling the greedy war machine. The government needs to lie in order to gain support for its war aims. The media system, in every case, proves to be a superior propaganda organ for militarism and empire. McChesney continues, and listen to what he's saying, this is important stuff. The United States media conglomerates exist within an institutional context that makes support for the U.S. military seemingly natural. These giant firms are among the primary beneficiaries of both neoliberal and globalization. and the U.S. role as the preeminent world power. Indeed, the United States government is the primary advocate for the global media firms. Isn't it clear what's taking place? The mainstream corporate media and the power elite are no longer separate entities. There's no dividing line between them any longer. They're in bed together, with the multinational globalists whipping the reporters, anchors, and editors like obedient dogs. And I have to tell you, the scent they're following isn't one that benefits us, but only further promotes the controllers' New World Order goals. Here is my plea to reporters and journalists. Please, before it's too late, bury your cowardice and stand up to your bosses. Why are you selling your country, your family, and yourself out? Can't you see what's happening in America? We're being deliberately undermined by a group of power-hungry devils that allow 100,000 people to die of starvation every day, that created a deadly sex virus and uses it to commit genocide on entire peoples, that advocates a perpetual bloodthirsty war machine that is now ready to start rolling in overdrive. These same people steal our money via an unjust tax system, then pilfer even more money through their privately owned for-profit Federal Reserve System. These same people run drugs, launder money, murder as if they lived outside the law, and are increasingly setting up a Big Brother-type surveillance system that will alter the world in a way that'll bring us directly into George Orwell's 1984. They're also destroying the planet's environment with wild abandon, then building even more underground bases to protect themselves when shit starts hitting the fan, while we'll all be locked out in the cold to suffer and gasp for breath. Hell, they're even trampled the very foundation of our democratic system via vote scam, and do so with such arrogance, it's appalling. So I have to ask each and every journalist at CBS, the New York Times, Newsweek, CNN, local newspapers, and those of you talking on the radio, when are you going to expose these lying, murdering, traitorous devils for what they are? Why are you so afraid to stand up to them? If every journalist in this country decided to start telling the truth, we could run those bastards out of town in a week. That's all it would take, telling the truth. Be a man, be a woman, be a true parent and American, and do what's right. Quit telling lies and let the American people know what's really going on in the world. That's your duty and responsibility. Forget about status, position, and money. Just tell the truth. For in the end, what does it matter if you've gained the entire world but lost your soul in the process? It's time for some dramatic changes in this country. And I challenge every member of the media to stand up and expose the controllers and their loathsome goals. If we don't do it soon, we won't have another chance. Are you willing to have that on your conscience? Chapter 57, Reviewed, The Octopus, Secret Government and the Death of Danny Casolaro by Ken Thomas and Jim Keith. The day before his suicide, Danny Casolaro told his brother, "If anything happens to me, don't believe it's an accident." The next day, August 10, 1991, Danny Casolaro was found dead in a hotel room, the slices in his wrist so deep they couldn't possibly have been done by someone experiencing that type of trauma and losing that much blood. If this were the only peculiarity surrounding Mr. Casolaro's death, it could be dismissed. But like other suspicious suicides surrounding those involved with governmental shenanigans, there's plenty of other evidence pointing to foul play. First of all, the suicide note found in Casolaro's hotel room was clearly bogus, considering the victim was a professional writer. Also, he was embalmed without his family's permission, while the autopsy was hastily performed and inconclusive. In addition, Casolaro's room was cleared of all evidence before the authorities were notified. His briefcase and a voluminous amount of notes vanished, and the police investigation only started days after the death took place. Now, the big question: what made certain individuals want to kill Danny Casolaro? The story begins with INSLAW, the Institute for Law and Social Research. This company developed a computer program for the United States Justice Department called PROMIS, Prosecutors Management Information System. The software allowed government computers to communicate with other computers so they could follow certain people and monitor them over long periods of time. Ari Ben-Menashe, author of Prophets of War, describes PROMIS software. The program would have the ability to track the movements of vast numbers of people around the world. Dissidents or citizens who needed to be kept under watch would be hard put to move freely without Big Brother keeping an eye on their activities. Ben-Menashe then went on to describe how the program worked. Using a modem, the spy network would tap into the computers of such services as the telephone company, the water board, other utility commissions, credit card companies, etc. PROMIS would then search for specific information. The researcher concludes by saying, PROMIS can suck in every other database on Earth and correlate everything automatically. The above information is troubling enough, but it gets worse. A covert sector of the government, specifically Edwin Meese's Justice Department, crafted a nefarious plot to steal the PROMIS program and modify it so that back doors could be opened to look into the database of targeted individuals. One of the companies involved in this scheme was Wackenhut, the world's largest private security firm. These are also the same cowboys who patrol the infamous Area 51 and were hired as security at the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. Former FBI agent George Wackenhut formed this company in 1954. With connections to J. Edgar Hoover by 1965, Wackenhut had files on over 2.5 million American citizens, which was less than 1 out of every 50 people. William Hamilton, CEO of INSLAW, said that the ultimate purpose of stealing the PROMIS software was to forward information to the National Security Agency, NSA satellites, so they could more easily access it. It will track anything once it's provided with the rules, he said. In simplest terms, the PROMIS software could track a person anywhere, on planes, trains, or automobiles. Even if an individual used fake IDs, they could still be fingered via their hairstyle, eye color, height, etc., then run through the system. After the Justice Department stole this program, it was sold to various spy networks and military operations around the world, such as Iraq, Libya, South Korea, Israel, and Canada. The pirated software became so widespread that at one time it was used in nearly 1,000 locales in Canada and ultimately spread like the tentacles of an octopus. Worse, the users were involved in drug dealing, money laundering, arms sales, assassinations, and biowarfare. If it stopped here, things would be bad enough. But a computer program called Brainstorm took the surveillance abilities of PROMIS to the next level by tying it into artificial intelligence programs. After doing so, the Secret Service or military could predict any person's behavior just by knowing their thought processes and personality traits. Based on this overview, it's easy to see why Danny Casolaro was snuffed in 1991. If he had brought this information to light in a big way, the PROMIS software would not have been developed as it was, ultimately bringing us such nasty Big Brother tools as Echelon and Carnivore. Things have gotten so out of control recently. The Wall Street Journal announced that authorities in Washington, D.C. plan to install the nation's largest network of surveillance cameras in history. Thousands of cameras will be mounted on our national monuments, in malls, schools, public transportation facilities, and in open areas. Once completed, this network will be a working model for other large and small cities in America. Do you know what the concept of Big Brother means? I hope so, because it's rolling over us like a freight train under the guise of Homeland Security. Below are a few notes and quotes that I found interesting in the book by Ken Thomas and Jim Keith. The Octopus was a secret group begun by CIA operative James Jesus Angleton. It wasn't the government per se, but it did influence every part of the government. They weren't highly ordered, but loosely based, like the mob. Essentially, they worked as a spy network, bringing about Richard Nixon's downfall at Watergate. They also ousted the Shah of Iran, ran drugs out of the Golden Triangle, orchestrated the Bay of Pigs fiasco, dirtied their fingers in the BCCI money scandal, brought about Ronald Reagan's October surprise, ran drugs and guns into Latin America, worked on the peripheral of JFK's assassination, murdered Chile's Allende, and set events in motion to bring about America's war in Iraq. In essence, many of the same names kept popping up at each of the following events. Castro's failed assassination attempts, the Bay of Pigs, JFK's assassination, Watergate, and gun running in Central America. These names were Richard Helms, Ray Klein, E. Howard Hunt, Edwin Wilson, Thomas Kleins, Ted Shackley, Frank Sturgis, and Felix Rodriguez. The CIA has enjoyed a long-term relationship with the Mafia that began in 1936 with Operation Underworld. In the years that followed, they've supported their black budget projects via money laundering, drug importing, casinos, and illegal arms running. George Bush took part in the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which utilized the codename Operation Zapata. Zapata, coincidentally, was the name of his oil company at that time. Bush also had oil rigs 30 miles off the coast of Cuba that were a key CIA stronghold near Sal. Here, he let the CIA use Zapata as a front company. Solara's notes, Zapata, 1953 narcotics smuggling, shadow government. The Bush family fortune was secured in large part through the rise of Hitler, through his famous Union Banking Corporation, which acted as a front for the Nazis, specifically the major German financier Fritz Thyssen. Skull and Bones, Yale, was founded by General George Russell, who controlled the United States opium market in the early 1800s. The authors contend that George Bush, while ambassador in China, started the Black Rose organization that ran drugs from the Golden Triangle to America through his offshore oil rigs. H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's sidekick, admitted there was a halt to the Watergate investigations by the FBI because they were about to bring to light the Bay of Pigs thing, which he admitted was a code word for the JFK assassination. In the May 7, 1977 edition of the San Francisco Chronicle, Frank Sturgis declared, "The reason we burglarized the Watergate was because Nixon was interested in stopping news leaks relating to the photos of our role, Helms, Hunt, Baker, Mosbacher, in the assassination of President Kennedy. Because President Nixon was trying to undermine the CIA's authority, as JFK also did, threatening to break them into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the wind, Watergate became a CIA plot to sabotage Nixon's administration." Casolaro on Oliver North and drugs. Diary entry, July 9, 1984. Wanted aircraft to go to Bolivia to pick up paste. Want aircraft to pick up 1,500 kilos. July 12, 1985 entry. 14 million to finance supermarket came from drugs. Supermarket is the code word for weapons storage area used in arms dealing. The Octopus was a small band of CIA outsiders who joined forces to advance their agenda through international crime and political intrigue. Drug dealing goes hand in hand with international banking, for both reap huge profits and also work with a world political crime syndicate. Chapter 58, The American Caste System. In an article entitled The Outlaw Among the Other Classes, published in Babel Magazine, number 59, May 19, 2002, Professor X provides the best overview of the American caste system I have ever read. By clearly defining 4 separate groups that are, by and large, mutually exclusive, rulers, enforcers, slaves, and untouchables, plus one other variable, the outlaw, the author exposes a phenomenon that is an embarrassment to the rulers and media of this country. Although it is possible to move from one class to another as opposed to the Indian class system, as Professor X points out, generally built-in factors to this societal framework prohibit such movement. The outcome, regrettably, is a situation that contradicts everything we've ever been taught about American democracy since our earliest school days. How about this first-grade lie? Anyone can grow up to be the president. I'm sorry to tell you, but anyone can't grow up to be the commander-in-chief. First, we'll examine the 4 primary classes, then in a later article, we'll look at possibly the only hope we have to alter this system, the outlaw class. The ruling class, also known as the controllers and the princes of the earth, these are the elite international bankers, heads of multinational corporations, and moneyed American families that largely determine the destiny of this planet. This group is undoubtedly the most exclusive and difficult to enter. Some would say it is virtually impossible to become a member of this class because of its obsession with bloodlines. The ruling class is far less than 1% of the total population, probably closer to 0.00000000001%. Its members belong to organizations such as the Bilderbergs, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, Club of Rome, Knights of Malta, etc., and rely heavily on secrecy to perpetuate their status. Whenever we examine the evils of this world, such as the financing of war, usury, and divisiveness among the masses, the controllers or members of the ruling class are invariably behind it. The enforcement class. When pondering the seeming implausibility of a minuscule percentage of the population lording over the remainder of society, one has to ask, how are these hidden figures able to maintain their position atop the control pyramid? In all reality, when viewed in terms of survival of the fittest, unlike Nimrod or Genghis Khan, none of these current controllers gain their status because of their physical prowess. Rather, they utilize a more subtle technique. Specifically, they create a network of enforcers to surround and protect their interests, then reward these individuals and entities with a few pieces of silver. Who, you may ask, represents the enforcement class and acts in the employ of the controllers? The media. Although it is generally perceived that the American media is by and large liberally oriented, it is, in reality, very conservative in nature. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about the slant of its content, but its overall profile. To be conservative connotes an acceptance of and inherent desire to preserve the status quo, i.e., keeping things the way they are. In this light, our media is extremely conservative because there isn't one element of the mainstream, whether it's CBS, the New York Times, Newsweek, Rush Limbaugh, or U.S. News and World Report, that wants to shake things up. If they did, we'd see a flurry of reports on what's really going on in this country or world. But then, someone might ask, isn't it one of the journalistic credos to dig deep and convey the truth? Of course it is, but when every major media source is owned by only a handful of multinational corporations, which are in turn owned by international bankers, then we see what's happening. The media, acting as a lapdog servant of the ruling class, enforces the status quo by only relaying half-truth, misinformation, and a general atmosphere of conditioning that keeps the masses from rebelling against those who subjugate them. The police. Since there is strength in numbers and the controllers are an extremely small percentage of the whole, force is needed to keep the people in line. When they get a little uppity or want to rebel, these beings serve as the strong arm for the ruling class. The military. Likewise, since the controllers don't have a particular allegiance to any nation or flag, their best interests are served by warring upon any country that seeks to buck their regimented framework of control. War is also used as a profit-making enterprise and also to keep the machine rolling along smoothly. They'd never want people sitting around too long without anything to do. That is why war is so vital to their interests. They have to keep the presses in the factories running, making bombs and guns, so that the lowly people they're shipping off to war don't get enough time on their hands to start figuring out the controller's agenda. By throwing in a dose of propaganda and patriotism and thinning out the herd, everything keeps rolling along smoothly. Regrettably, the only winners in war are the controllers. They make money via interest off their loans and the rebuilding process, while all the rest of us are dead, maimed, or traumatized by the process. Academia and the educational system. Since the controllers realize that truth and exposure would ruin the illusion they've so carefully created, they need another arm to prevent the masses from knowing too much. Thus, instead of truly educating them, they are indoctrinated with the proper mode of thinking so they fit into society like a good little cog in the wheel. Similar to the media that could open our eyes but ought not to, academia also suppresses the truth by feeding us the same old cultural myth and remembering one important fact: he who wins the war writes the history book. Since the controllers are the only ones who win in war, guess who's spreading all the disinformation? Yep, you're right, they are. If you don't believe me, sit in on any college history, political science, or economics class, and I guarantee they won't be telling you any of this stuff. Court system. As an attached branch of the police and sometimes the military, the courts penalize wrongdoers by removing their freedoms. Obviously, many members of society need restraint, but the threat of punishment also keeps the law-abiding citizen from becoming too vocal about the smokescreen. Bureaucratic institutions. Perfect examples would be the IRS, FBI, or CIA. Enough said. Religion. Finally, by playing on notions which involve morality, the hereafter, salvation, and punishment, the masses can be kept tranquilized by fears and blind faith, thus tempering their natural instincts and drives. With the above information in mind, the next logical question should be, what purpose does the enforcement class serve? Professor X succinctly explains the situation by saying that these groups maintain images of so-called normalcy by perpetuating deception and manipulating the masses. He adds that they are designed to inoculate any sign of free thinking before it becomes contagious to the slave class. The most important question is, why does the enforcement class carry out the controllers' plans when it's obvious that so many of their aims are not in the country's best interest? The answer, I'm sorry to say, is twofold: self-interest and cowardice. Even though the enforcement class will never in its wildest dreams attain the type of wealth enjoyed by the rulers, it is still by and large better off than the majority of society. Stated differently, the system works for them. They're doing well, so if they start exposing the truth and riling things up, a few consequences could occur. One would be economic uncertainty, which would result in a possible stock market crash, unemployment, or a drop in corporate profits, thus lower dividends. Or, if taken to the extreme, there could be such social turmoil that governments may collapse, anarchy could erupt in the streets, or a bloody civil war would result. To those who are lapping up the gravy and living easy, such options are not welcomed or desired. If trouble starts brewing among the masses, it doesn't bode well for a judge, reporter, police sergeant, professor, general, IRS agent, or a deacon in his plush rectory. This rationale leads to our second point, cowardice. Why risk job security when one doesn't have to stamp parts in a factory or bale hay on a farm, but instead sit in an air-conditioned office when the result could threaten their house on the hill, a shiny Mitsubishi and SUV, manicured lawns, and evenings at the country club? The status quo, at least for the enforcement class, is much preferred to turmoil. Even if things aren't good or right in the world, at least these people are better off financially than most. Why rock the boat and jeopardize things? For someone to even mention subjects such as the Federal Reserve being a private, for-profit corporation, vote scam, or government black budget projects would encourage co-workers, fellow parishioners, neighbors, or lodge members to label that person a conspiracy nut or kook. Then, when it came time for advancement and raises, that person with the off-balance ideas would be passed over in favor of someone who's a team player. It's better to disregard the truth and stay away from such controversial topics, and safer to just cringe and accept things the way they are. Slave class. By far the largest segment of society, Professor X describes these folks as a worker bee group that is cultured to support the ruling and enforcement class. In other words, these are the people who assemble parts for their microwaves in a factory, haul away the trash, unclog the sewers, serve food, pump gas, drive taxis, balance the books, clean hotels, and perform 1,000 other jobs that they don't want to do. But if the slave class comprises at least 3/4 of the societal whole, why doesn't it wise up to the system and try to overthrow it, or at least try to dramatically change it? Professor X provides 3 main reasons why the masses have been pacified. 1. They're motivated by an illusion that they aren't, in fact, slaves, but rather free individuals. 2. They feel blessed to live in the USA, the greatest nation in the world, and to be overseen by a caring government that immensely cares about them. This government is increasingly a type of father figure that continues to exert more influence over each person's life, thus freeing them from any actual responsibility. 3. These individuals complain about taxes, inequality, and the crooks in office, but are promised a reward at the end of the line, Social Security benefits, heaven if they've been good, etc. The controllers maintain these programs with help from the enforcers by making sure the slaves have, to quote Professor X, full bellies, but never produce enough wealth to reach independence. He continues, wealth produced by the slave class must always be transferred to the ruling class. With our present system of taxation and mind control, this is extremely effective. In an efficient slave system, the slave must think he or she is in control, is free, in other words, but the slave must be left with only the bare minimum with which to provide his personal and family needs. The slave must work most of his or her life, giving over the bulk of his or her earnings to the ruling class. This is now being very efficiently accomplished in the United States, and for the most part, everyone is quite happy with the results. To put the above words in perspective, allow me to use an illustration. Every once in a while, I eat at a Chinese restaurant that has an immense framed photograph of the Great Wall of China snaking through the mountains. Although this picture only captures a small percentage of the wall's total 1,450 miles, it is still mind-boggling in its enormity. While staring at this photograph, I thought about all the Chinese lackeys required to construct the Great Wall. Even in our current age, most Chinese citizens don't have many rights or freedoms. Just think how intolerable it was in those days when the wall was being built, starting in 2214 BC. These people were merely slaves. I then started thinking about all the regal European castles and churches that were constructed during medieval times while the feudal system was in effect. Naturally, the aristocracy, kings, queens, and princes lorded over the serfs, who surrendered their sweat and muscle power to erect these magnificent structures. Most people who would ponder this situation would think, man, what fools those people must have been. They were nothing but slaves. But has the overall class structure actually changed that much over the past millennium? Yeah, certain particulars have improved, and today we have indoor plumbing, heat, automobiles, and modern medicine, to name just a few conveniences. But in terms of a hierarchical caste system, are things dramatically different? Professor X estimates that 70% of America's population, and the number would be closer to 90% if we took the entire world into consideration, is still stuck in the slave class. The controllers of today, bankers, CEOs, etc., are merely the lords and emperors of times past. Since this essay is called The American Caste System, let's actually take a look at how things work in India. Hindu society is divided into 5 main groups. 1. Brahmins, priests, those who lorded over society when this system arose. Do these figures remind you of today's ruling class controllers? 2. Kshatriyas, nobles and warriors, the enforcement class. Vaisyas, traders and farmers, plus Sudras, servants, the slave class. Harijan, untouchables. Does this sound vaguely familiar to what we currently have in America? Naturally, some upward and downward mobility exists in this country, but think about it. How many people do you personally know who have truly transcended their class? Certainly, someone can go to college or work very hard and migrate from one class to the next. But what are the odds that a member of the slave class will join the elite class, or even someone from the enforcement class, for that matter? Or how often does one of the untouchables ascend to become an enforcer? Rarely. We're all pretty much stuck in our class, which in America is largely comprised of a middle class that is snowballed into thinking it has some say-so in how this country is being run, but quite plainly, it doesn't. Look at the personal debt we're carrying. It's never been higher. What does that tell you? That the middle class is thriving? No, it shows that most Americans are living from one paycheck to another, can't completely cover their expenses, and if they lost their jobs would be in dire straits. Actually, plenty of Americans are losing their jobs, especially in the industrial and manufacturing fields due to NAFTA, and replacing them with lower-paying service jobs. The slave class is so busy trying to make ends meet, there isn't time to worry about much else. And guess what? That's exactly the way the controllers have designed the system. Due to being heavily taxed, indebted, and with scores of bills to pay, plus lawns to mow, raking leaves, cooking dinner, taking care of kids, fixing the car, and so forth, there isn't much time left to get involved. Or, as someone once said to me, I do have a cause, putting food on the table and making sure I have enough money to keep the roof from leaking and paying the fuel bill this winter. Do you still not think we have a caste system in this country? How much chance does this individual have of jumping up to the next level? But before you start screaming that I'm being pessimistic, let me clarify. I believe in hard work and industriousness as much as anyone. That's why I write essays and make sure as many people as possible read them. I want to see this world become a better place. But I'm also a realist who observes certain things, and what I see is a firmly established framework that was intentionally designed to keep people busy, enslaved, and too occupied to exert the effort to modify our caste system. Keep the machine running, the controllers need people to produce goods and services for them. But if we make certain products, we also need to buy items such as CD players, $150 tennis shoes, boats, BMWs, and home entertainment systems. So, via a subtle form of conditioning called advertising, coupled with the ingrained concept of our American dream, people are constantly striving to keep up with the Joneses and living beyond their means, all in the name of a larger scheme that most people don't even know exists. By promoting concepts such as freedom, patriotism, and a materialistic American dream, plus the utilization of various conditioning techniques, the masses remain in their place, continually exploited and manipulated by the evil ruling class. The untouchables. Derided by members from nearly every walk of life, this class does not contribute to society in any meaningful way. Described by Professor X as inner city blacks, drug addicts, street people, and the criminal underclass, these individuals would not dramatically alter their lives regardless of who governed them. Simply surviving day to day, the untouchables are corralled into pockets far removed from the rest of society and are generally ignored unless they infringe upon the other classes, which then draws immediate punishment. The bare essentials are given to them, and then they are forgotten, out of sight, out of mind.